for the delay again with technical difficulties that we still need to work out, but we are getting started now, and this is Letter to Philippi Live with Sean Emslie. And Letter to Philippi Live is an initiative of Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological organization focused on lifting up Yeshua and living within the context of Judaism today, and building a Messianic Judaism that honors the Torah, respects Jewish tradition, and lives within Jewish space and Jewish community. And today we continue our study in the book of Philippians. Today we'll be looking at the start of the Messianic hymn in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. This here is these 6 verses represent what could be considered one of the first Messianic hymns, the first Messianic praise songs, the Messianic Jewish songs about Yeshua. It is believed that this was actually written in the Jerusalem Messianic community, and originally in Hebrew or Aramaic. And here, Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to Philippi, translated into Greek for the letter being that it was written in Greek. And here we have as I said so many times, over 1900 years before my rabbi Stuart Dowerman and began writing Messianic Jewish hymns. We have here a Messianic Jewish hymn honoring Yeshua and acknowledging Yeshua as one with the one God of Israel in the middle of the first century of the Common Era. Letter was written about 62 in the Common Era. So this was a hymn that was available and known by the Messianic communities, and Rav Shaul is sharing it in Greek to those who are in the Philippian community. So it's a powerful thing to understand that this early in the beginning of the Messianic Jewish community, that there was an acknowledgement of Yeshua as the divine Messiah, that he was the one God of Israel that came into our world to seek and to save, and to be the final atonement for sin. So today we'll be looking specifically at verses 6 and 7 of chapter 2. And just to give us the context, we'll be looking through over the next several days. As we will get into verses 8, 9, 10, 11, will pretty much be individual days of study. So this will be going through this week and into next week. But to give a whole context of this hymn, I want to read Philippians 2, 6 through 11 right now, and then we'll look deeper into verses 6 and 7. And this is from Dr. Stern's translation of the Complete Jewish Bible. Verse 6, though he was in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God something to be possessed by force. On the contrary, he emptied himself, in that he took the form of the slave, by becoming a human being, by becoming like human beings are. And when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more, by becoming obedient even to death on a stake as a criminal. Therefore God raised him to the highest place, and gave him the name above every name, that in honor of the name given to Yeshua, every knee will bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and every tongue will acknowledge that Yeshua the Messiah is Adonai, to the glory of God the Father. These verses represent a Messianic hymn, an early praise song, an early theologically based praise song, declaring who Yeshua is and his coming into our world, humbly, born as a baby, living a life of humility, dying the death of a slave on the Roman cross. But that was not the end of the story. That his work of atonement was complete. He rose from the dead. He ascended to heaven to reclaim his place in the heavenlies as the one God of Israel coming into our world. And one day, may that day be soon, he will be acknowledged by all the created order, both what's in the heavenlies, what's are on the earth now, those under the earth, both the physical and the spiritual world will acknowledge the Messiahship and Lordship of Yeshua one day. And as I said, may that day come soon. We want Messiah to come and to return and to bring the world to come. These verses represent a missing hymn which tells the coming of the Messiah into the world as a slave, his death on the Roman stake, the cross, and his exaltation to being Lord of all creation. Many scholars believe Paul was quoting from a previously written hymn or liturgical prayer that the people of Philippi would have believed and even used in their corporate worship as a teaching tool to emphasize the humility Yeshua perfectly modeled and Paul called them to pursue. As I said, this was an early Messianic Jewish hymn acknowledging Yeshua as Lord and King and acknowledging his place coming into our world humbly, but that one day he will be acknowledged as King over all of creation. Larry Hurtado, who was a biblical scholar who recently passed away, agrees that these verses can be understood to be an early Messianic Jewish hymn or liturgical prayer, similar to other hymns in existence at the time. Paul's letter, which would have been existence at the time of Paul's letter. This hymn would have been familiar to the Philippian community. Hymns like this were familiar in the Roman world this time as songs to the various gods of the pagan world. But in this we see the use of a hymn honoring Yeshua the Messiah as the divine Messiah, as the one God of Israel that came into our world humbly and will one day be acknowledged by all creation. So we see that in this hymn, that the basic understanding of the life, the death, the resurrection, and one day exaltation as King over all creation is let forward in these words. And it really is amazing to see how these last verses 9 through 11 have been integrated in Messianic Jewish worship in various different liturgies that have included that as part of the Aleinu, and it seems that we're now re-grasping these words and bringing them back into Messianic Jewish worship, and it's really encouraging to see that of men born as a helpless baby into our world and living a life that would end up him dying the death of a slave on the Roman cross. The highest example of humility is Yeshua. In speaking of Yeshua in the form of God, Paul here is showing that we see a contrast between Adam, the first man, who was created in God's image as a human that sought divine knowledge and status by eating the forbidden fruit in Eden, which we see in Genesis 3. And Yeshua, who is eternally divine and came into our world humbly as a human. Novatian, who was a 3rd century Christian theologian, wrote, "If Messiah were only a man, he would have been said to have been in the image of God, not in the form of God. We know that humanity was made in the image, not the form of God." Yeshua's pre-incarnation status, before he came into our world, was and remained divine in the form of God. We as humans are born into the image of God. That we were created. Man was created. Adam was created in the image of God. But you hear this passage here, Yeshua, it comes in our world. He is in the form of God. But he is not just an image of God, he is God himself coming into our world. As the fully divine Yeshua became a man, in contrast to being just a human in the image of God, he came into the world in the form of God on a divine mission. In keeping with the letter's theme of humility, Yeshua set aside his place in glory in the heavenlies to come into the world as the greatest example of humility, going from the height of divinity as the one God of Israel, becoming a human, as we'll see in the verse 7, assuming the lowest form of humanity, a slave will be executed on the Roman stake. As the divine Son, Yeshua came into our world as a slave, on a singular mission to bring redemption to the world by his death on the stake, demonstrating the highest level of humility by willingly giving himself to serve, and on behalf of those he came to seek and to save. Although as Messiah and the divine Messiah, Yeshua had full rights to all that is divine in his time here on earth, but he did not seize this power, or as another way of saying this, nor did he possess it by force. But in his life, he was willingly died as a man without exploiting his divine nature. Though in this world, Yeshua had full access, the full rights to all divine power and authority, but he set that aside for the sake of his role as the humble servant, that he did not, as it says, possess it by force or seize by power his place as the divine one in the world, but he was able to live his life as a servant in this world and to suffer and die for the redemption of the world. The preexistence of a divine Messiah was an established belief in Judaism of the first century, which can be seen in the Tanakh, most notably in the servant songs of Isaiah, especially Isaiah 52:13, 53:12, which is one of the most common passages that we will reflect on about the Messiah coming to the world, about the role of him, the suffering servant. In the Talmud, we also see that the pre-existence of the Messiah was part of early rabbinic thought. In the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Pesachim 54a, we read, Seven things were created before the world was made, and these are they: Torah, repentance, the Garden of Eden, Gehenna, the throne of glory, the house of the sanctuary, and the name of the Messiah. And the name of the Messiah, and this is a quote from Psalm 72:17, his name shall endure forever and existed before the sun. And again, that's from the Bavli, from Babylonian Talmud, Pesachim 54a. The rabbis listed 7 things that pre-existed the creation of the world. The 7th being the name of the Messiah, which they drew from Psalm 72:17. Psalm 72:17, which reads in full, "May his name endure forever, his name be known as long as the sun. May people bless themselves in him. May all nations call him happy." In verse 6 here in Philippians 2, Paul speaks plainly and with explanation about the pre-existence of Yeshua in line with established Jewish thought concerning the pre-existence of the Messiah. And much like the opening of Genesis 1, where God is presented as the creator of all things without explanation, Genesis 1:1 just says, "In the beginning God created the world," without any explanation about that, any background of that. It just comes out straight out that in the beginning God created the world. Paul here in verse 6 plainly comes out and says, Yeshua, the Messiah, Yeshua, the man who lived in this world, was the one God of Israel, who came into our world as the suffering servant, as the one to bring redemption. Without explanation, but just saying this is what it is. Yeshua is the divine Messiah. He is the one God of Israel who entered our world to seek and to save and to bring redemption to Israel and to the nations. Here Paul makes clear his deep understanding and core theological belief that Yeshua is the pre-existent Son of God who was the source of the creation of the world. We can see Paul speaking of the pre-existence of Yeshua as the source of creation of the cosmos in his correspondence to the Messianic community in Corinth, where he wrote, and this is from 1 Corinthians 8:6, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things come, and for whom we exist, and one Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, through whom were created all things, and through whom we have our being." As we saw in the Talmud in Bavli, Pesachim 54a, Paul here places Yeshua the Messiah into the creation of the cosmos, the one who entered humbly into our world as part of creation, was the one who was the source of all creation. The Jewish tradition related to Enoch also demonstrate that a belief in a divine messianic figure was understood in part of Jewish understanding and expectations. In 1 Enoch 37-71, we see the Hebrew word Mashiach twice in reference to a heavenly transcendent figure. In this we can see that the eternal nature of the Messiah was a well-understood belief among the early Yeshua followers in Philippi and elsewhere, and was part of first century Second Temple Jewish thought that the Messiah was a divine figure. Paul here puts forward that what is known as a high Christology. That's a fancy theological word, meaning an understanding of Yeshua as one with the God of Israel. That in a high Christology coming from the Greek, the study of the Christ, the study of the Messiah. And in having a high Christology, you have a high understanding of the divine nature of Yeshua, that you understand Yeshua as the one God of Israel that entered our world in the person of Yeshua the Messiah. So Paul here puts forward what is known as a high Christology, an understanding of the eternal divine nature of Yeshua that he bore even before his birth into our world. An early high Christology within the earliest Messianic community, argues Daniel Bayorin in his book, The Jewish Gospels, can be seen from the belief in the divine Messiah. The Messiah is a God-man based in Jewish tradition, grounded in the prophecies. So this is a quote from the scholar Daniel Bayorin, who is a Jewish scholar at Berkeley, California, and he writes here in his book on Jesus and the Gospels, "I submit that it is impossible to understand the Gospel only if both Yeshua and the Jews around him held to a high Christology, whereby the claim to Messiahship was also a claim to being a divine man. Were it not the case, we would be very hard-pressed to understand the extremely hostile reaction to Yeshua on the part of Jewish leaders who do not accept his claim." So Boyer here, this biblical scholar, this Jewish biblical scholar, in this section from his book on the Gospels, says that it's clearly it must be clearly understood that the reaction to Yeshua by both his followers and those who rejected him only makes sense if there was an understanding of a high Christology within Judaism of the first century. That both the reaction, the changed lives of the disciples of Yeshua, and the hostile reaction to Yeshua by the Jewish leaders who opposed him would only make sense in the context of the understanding that Yeshua's claim to Messiahship was his claim to being divine. That in in the declaration, Yeshua is the Messiah, there was an understanding that you were also saying Yeshua is the one God of Israel that came into our world. The scholars debate the early nature of the belief in the eternal divine nature of Yeshua among his earliest followers, and credit to a later development at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. We can see here that Paul, writing in the 60s of the Common Era, clearly put forward a divine Yeshua, who, like the Father, was pre-existent before the incarnation. Most scholars today, many in the academic world, understand that it really wasn't until the time of Constantine, the time of the Nicene Council in 325 of the Common Era, and later church councils, that the understanding of Yeshua as being fully divine, that he was the God of Israel that came into the world, was a development that wasn't until the 4th century of the Common Era, that there wasn't this understanding in the early Messianic community. It was something that was actually the church fathers developed, an understanding of Yeshua being divine, that he is being God in human form. But we can see here that in Paul here, writing in the 60s of the Common Era, that he put forward clearly an understanding that Yeshua was the divine Messiah, that he was not just a man who came into the world, but he was the divine Messiah. He was the God of Israel who came into our world to seek and to save. And we can see from Scripture that the only one who could offer full redemption, the only one who can truly save, is the one God of Israel. So if Yeshua was not the one God of Israel coming to our world, that he could not have been the one to offer complete redemption, complete atonement. We can also see a reference to Yeshua as the second Adam in this verse, as the first Adam chose to eat the forbidden fruit that would make him like God, knowing good and evil, which we see in Genesis chapter 3. Yeshua, as the second Adam, in contrast, chose to lay aside his place of God, to come into this world to live as a man. So we can see a reference here to Yeshua as the second Adam, the second Adam, where the first Adam was a human being who sought to be God by eating from the forbidden fruit. Yeshua was truly God, who laid aside his place as God temporarily to come into this world to live as a man. So whereas as Adam sought godhood from humanity, Yeshua went from his place of God into humanity. That he became part of the created order. The very humanity that he created, he became part of in the person of Yeshua. The second half of the verse teaches the eternal power and glory of the Godhood that Yeshua willingly set aside for his life on earth. And this is from Christian scholar D.A. Carson, where he wrote, Philippians 2:6 must be understood to mean that Christ's equality with God was not something to be exploited. And as such, equality was intrinsically his. But so great was his humility and subservience to the will of his Father that he chose not to exploit it, but took the path of humiliation, incarnation, and death on a cross. And as I said, that was from D.A. Carson, a Christian scholar. And now we come to verse 7. We're running. Verse 7 reads, on the contrary, he emptied himself in that he took the form of a slave by becoming like human beings are, and when he appeared as a human being. The Greek word for emptied is knou. Many scholars understand that Yeshua in his incarnation emptied himself of the omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience of God. For those unfamiliar with those big theological omnipotence, being all-powerful, omnipresence is all present everywhere, and an omniscient is knowing everything. Emptying himself, Yeshua could signify the sinless Savior's sacrificial death, where he poured out his life and bore the sin of many. In this verse, Paul teaches that Yeshua, the eternal Messiah, came into the world as a flesh and blood human being, in contrast to the later Gnostic groups and the proto-Gnostic teachings of the time, which espoused that the man Yeshua became divine, or the divine Yeshua just appeared to be in the world. We see in this passage that's making clear that Yeshua was a flesh and blood human being in our world. That he came into our world to seek and to save as a human being. As Yeshua became man and entered into his creation uniquely and intimately, while there had been a brief glimpse of the one God of Israel in the Tanakh, interacting with human beings, in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament scriptures, Yeshua, as the one God of Israel, empties himself to enter the world fully and encounter his created beings as one of them. As Paul models Yeshua in his life and calls the Philippians to join him in becoming more and more like the Messiah, Paul shares the example of Yeshua lowly entering into our world and in his life of submission to the divine plan as the model for the Philippians and for us by extension to emulate. Now we'll look at the phrase, he took the form of a slave. More than just becoming a human being, Yeshua became a slave. Paul shows the example of Yeshua's willingness to be a slave as one accepting the lowest place in society. Interestingly enough, in the opening of the letter in Philippians 1:1, Paul makes the Philippians aware that both he and Timothy are slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. They are seeking to model in their lives the humility and submission to Messiah. The Yeshua they're calling the believers of Philippi to pursue with them. And as they see themselves, understand themselves as slaves of the Messiah Yeshua, they're calling the people of Philippi, and us by example, into being slaves of the Messiah. In both Philippians 1:1 and here in 2:7, Paul uses a form of the Greek word doulos, which Dr. Stern translated as slave. Doulos can also be translated as servant or bondservant. Some Bibles, including the English Standard Version, use servant in these verses instead of slave. But these terms are basically interchangeable because most servants in this time were in fact slaves during this historical period. In the shared use of doulos for Paul and Timothy, as well as Yeshua, we see a parallel between Paul and Timothy's devotion to Yeshua as his slaves, and Yeshua as the slave of the divine plan, leading to the Roman execution stake, the cross, and his death as a slave to that plan. In his humble entry into our world, Yeshua became the embodiment of the Messianic aspirations, seen in Isaiah's servant songs, where we read, even more he exposed himself to death and bearing the sins of many and interceding for the offenders. And that was from Isaiah 53:12. Speaking of the servant of the Isaiah 53 passage as entering the world, exposing himself to death like Yeshua was exposed to death. Yeshua is the fulfillment of Isaiah's servant songs, of which Isaiah 53 is the best known and most often quoted. Yeshua's humble entry into the world was more than just the one God of Israel entering the world as a man to live among and a fellowship with his creation. Yeshua came into the world as a lowly slave, servant, demonstrating humility as he temporarily left the highest eternal state to assume the lowest earthly state. And next we come to the phrase, becoming like human beings are. There are two words in Greek, genomai and geneo, that can mean born or become. In this verse, Paul uses the Greek word genomai rather than geneo to convey the meaning of a change in status, which is what we see in Yeshua's emptying himself, temporarily leaving his pre-existent divine state and coming into our world as a human being. Other uses of genomai in the Brit Hadashah include the transfiguration of Yeshua in Matthew 17:2. We read, "As they watched, he, Yeshua, began to change form," genomai. "His face shone like the sun, and his clothing became as white as light." In Matthew, genomai is used to describe Yeshua's clothing changing to bright white as he makes his glory known to his closest Talmudim disciples. Through the transfiguration, we can see the coming together of the human and divine in Yeshua. As Albert Nolan, biblical scholar, wrote, Yeshua's divinity is not something totally different from his humanity. Yeshua's divinity is the transcendent depth of his humanity. Yeshua was immeasurably more human than other men. Becoming a man was not a sign that Yeshua was inferior to the Father because of his innate inborn divine status. Though humbled in the incarnation, demonstrated that the obedience of Yeshua is the voluntary, joyful, thankful obedience of a son, the true sacrificed, transparent obedience of an equal. And that comes from biblical scholar O'Callaghan. I'll read that again. The obedience of Christ is the voluntary, joyful, thankful obedience of a son, the true, sacrificed, transparent obedience of an equal. In this act of humility, Yeshua, as divine Lord, entered the world to seek and to save, doing the work only God can do. Thus, the one God of Israel again steps into human history to offer redemption, which only comes from the divine one. The role of Redeemer can only be filled by the one God of Israel, as I mentioned earlier. And this comes from Deuteronomy 10:70-18, which we read, "For Adonai, your God, is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, who secures justice for the orphan and the widow, loves the foreigner, gives him food and clothing." So we see here from the Torah, from Deuteronomy 10, that it's made clear that the only one who can truly bring redemption is the one God of Israel. He is the one. He is the only one. Adonai is the only one that is great, mighty, and awesome, and who can come and bring justice and redemption to the world. And this is why Yeshua must be understood as divine, because only the one God of Israel could be the one to bring redemption, the one who could bring the justice for the poor, and to bring the healing to the world as needed. So Yeshua, as the divine Messiah, is a necessity. The Messiah must be the one God of Israel to come into the world, because only the one God of Israel could be the Redeemer of the world. And this is something that Rosh Shaul puts here and puts forward here in this passage, and from the use of the Messianic hymn here, this clear understanding that Yeshua, as the one God of Israel, came into the world to seek and to save, and it was only the one God of Israel who could be the Redeemer of the whole world. So this here will conclude our look at Philippians chapter 2, 6-7, as we begin looking at the Messianic hymn more in depth, and we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verse 8 tomorrow, as we continue on looking at the Messianic hymn. And I'll try to get to just to give you a preview. We'll look at that. This is a preview I'll read to you. Philippians chapter 2 to 8 to get you ready for tomorrow. And when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even to death, death on a stake as a criminal. So tomorrow we'll be looking at this, at the further humiliation of the Messiah, the further humbling of the Messiah. We saw in verse 6 and 7 that Yeshua came into our world as a baby born into our world as a flesh and blood human being and lived a life of humility. And now we'll be looking at the end of verse 7 and verse 8 tomorrow, where he takes a further step in his humbling, his humility, moving in to being humble to being given the death of a criminal, the death of a slave, the death on the stake, the death on the Roman cross, the continuing humiliation and humbling of the Messiah, that, as I said, it will culminate in verse 11 with his acknowledgement as the Messiah of Israel and the Lord of all creation. So we'll be looking at that tomorrow at the end of verse 7 and look in chapter 8 about the humbleness of the Messiah and his willingness to die the death on the Roman cross on the stake for us. So thank you for watching. We went a little bit longer today than usual, but we also got started later than usual, and I again apologize for that. And now after 2 days in a row of getting started late, I'm going to actually be sure tomorrow to be all ready to go well before noon, so we have a consistency on that. But thank you for watching. This has been Letter to Philippi Live. My name is Sean Emslie. I will be your teacher, and I am the founder of lettertophilippi.org, a new Messianic Jewish theological organization, and where we will be continuing. This is our first initiative of the new ministry, is the daily teaching through the book of Philippians, and we'll be adding more initiatives as we go on, both online and also looking to have live in-person gatherings and events and teaching sessions. So I ask you to continue to watch our broadcasts at Monday through Friday at 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And we'll be continuing our study tomorrow. And just please go to lettertophilippi.org, and you can find our previous teachings on Philippians. You can purchase my Messianic Jewish commentary on Philippians, which is this daily class is based off of. You can leave a prayer request. We want to be praying for you, as we'll be seeing in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, that we show our dependence on God by bringing everything to him in prayer. So we want to be praying for you, and I'll be praying personally for all of the requests that you send in. And we also ask you to consider making a financial donation to our work. We are a small new growing Messianic Jewish organization, and we could appreciate your financial support. You can go to our giving page and make a one-time donation, or even better, you can make a monthly donation to keep this work going. Help us to expand the work of sharing a modern Messianic Jewish theology, a modern understanding of the Jewish scriptures, and bringing this message that Yeshua is the Messiah. He is the divine Messiah who came into our world, and we live now as his Talmudim, looking to model him and become more and more like the Messiah every day. So thank you for watching. Go to lettertophilippi.org, and you can find out more about our work. And as I said, you can see previous videos, you can leave a prayer request, you can make a much needed donation to keep our work going. We thank you for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow, and I will see that we get started on noon, and see you then. So have a good day, everyone, and we will be closing for those who are Dodger fans. We hope we will see the Dodgers win tonight, and that will be all for today. So thank you for watching. Have a great day, and may you become more and more and more in the Messiah each day. Thank you for watching, and shalom.